Welcome back, everyone. We've got a seriously fascinating explainer lined up for you today. We're going to trace the history of a very specific field of science, one that actually started off with a brilliantly flawed idea. But here's the crazy part. That totally wrong idea ended up revolutionizing modern ecology. We're looking at the incredible journey of limnology. It started out as this romantic, almost poetic notion of nature and evolved into a hard-hitting, data-driven science that practically runs modern fisheries and aquatic management today. So let's just dive right in.
To kick things off, we really have to ask a seemingly simple question. Why lakes? I mean, out of all the incredible, complex environments on planet Earth, what is it about these bodies of water that makes scientists and ecologists so obsessed with them? You know, a scientist's job isn't just to wander around outside measuring random things. It's to test grand theories about how life operates. So why did early ecologists flock to the water's edge to do that?
Well, to be honest, part of the answer is probably just emotional. Kenneth Graham actually hit the nail on the head in The Wind in the Willows when he wrote, "There is nothing, absolutely nothing, half so worthwhile as simply messing about in boats." Water just has this undeniable aesthetic appeal, right? A lot of biologists probably get into the field simply because it's a beautiful environment to work in. But you can't build a robust scientific discipline just because you enjoy the scenery. There had to be a rigorous scientific reason why lakes became the ultimate testing ground.
And that brings us to limnology. Basically, it's the scientific study of fresh waters. And for the biologists out there, it's specifically the study of the living organisms that inhabit lakes. Now, like I said, science is all about finding the right environment to test big theories. If you want to predict how organisms interact, distribute themselves, or grow, you literally have to find a place where those variables are actually contained enough to observe.
Which brings us to our first major hurdle, the ecosystem problem.
See, carving up the biological world into observable units is an absolute nightmare. To study how an ecosystem works, you have to figure out where it begins and where it ends. Think about a woodland ecosystem. At first glance, it looks distinct, doesn't it? But if you really look closely, the boundaries are just incredibly blurred. How do you measure the exact interactions between an oak tree on a hill and a beech tree lower down? What about a fox that hunts in the woods but then runs through the tall grass and sleeps in a totally different valley? Or birds flying in from miles away just to roost? Where does the forest actually end and the grassland begin? It's chaos for a scientist trying to contain their variables.
Now contrast that giant, confusing headache with a lake ecosystem. It's practically night and day. With a lake, you take one step forward, you're in the water. You take one step back, you're on land. The shoreline is a sharp, definite boundary. Sure, you might have a few frogs or a kingfisher crossing the line, but by and large, the inhabitants of the lake are completely contained. When early scientists realized this, they were hooked. It was like a perfectly packaged scientific laboratory, custom crafted by nature.
And that crisp boundary led to what we now call the microcosm myth.
Back in 1887, a scientist named Stephen Forbes proposed an idea that was incredibly influential. He hypothesized that a lake was a little world within itself. He argued that the organisms inside that clear, contained basin were so deeply isolated from the land around them that if every single terrestrial animal on Earth was wiped out tomorrow, the inhabitants of the lake wouldn't even notice for a long, long time. It appeared to be a totally independent model system. To the scientists back then, this was literally the Holy Grail, an isolated microcosm where you could easily grasp the elemental forces of life.
Inside this supposedly perfect microcosm, early scientists focused heavily on the epilimnium. That's the lighted surface layer where photosynthesis happens. Imagine it kind of like a giant stew. The wind acts as a spoon, continuously stirring that surface layer. And all the microscopic algal cells, they're like pieces of vegetables in the pot. Because they're constantly stirred, every single cell is forced to bump into and compete with every other cell. So you get this incredible horizontal uniformation. You don't have to sample every square inch of the lake because the stew is already well mixed.
And the physical properties of the water only reinforce this illusion of simplicity. The vertical changes in light and temperature are gentle and really predictable. You drop a line down, take your measurements, and boom, you get a beautifully consistent picture of the biomass. No chasing migrating deer across a valley, no digging up elusive root systems, just a blissfully simple, homogeneous column of water. Honestly, it was almost too good to be true.
And, spoiler alert, it was. Enter the paradigm breaks.
As we rolled into the 20th century with huge population booms and industrial pollution, the evidence against this peaceful, isolated lake became a tidal wave. Scientists suddenly discovered massive influxes of nutrients flowing in from the surrounding watershed, totally dictating the limits of lake biomass. And it wasn't just natural runoff. We're talking airborne mercury, lead, PCBs, acid rain just pouring in from the airshed. The lake wasn't a pristine, isolated bowl at all. It was basically the ultimate sink for everything happening in the land and the air for miles around.
So the critical takeaway here is that the modern lake is emphatically not a microcosm. Actually, researchers figured out that in most lakes, the primary production of the plankton isn't even close to enough to feed the food web. Lakes require massive energy subsidies from their catchments just to keep the fish and organisms alive. The beautiful Forbesian paradigm, the whole reason early ecologists flocked to lakes in the first place, was fundamentally completely wrong.
But here is where the story gets really good. The failure of that myth gave us the era of predictive ecology.
You might think realizing the core theory was wrong would ruin the science, but it actually gave birth to an unbelievably powerful tool. Because early limnologists mistakenly believed the lake was isolated, they had spent decades meticulously measuring overall phosphorus and total biomass as whole lake variables. They accidentally built up this massive treasure trove of holistic data, and they soon realized they could use that data to spot huge, entirely predictable patterns. This approach is called empirical holism.
Now, for fisheries and aquaculture, this is an absolute game changer. When you look at the math here, focus on TP, or total phosphorus. By simply measuring the concentration of phosphorus flowing into a lake, limnologists realized they could mathematically predict the annual fish yield with shocking accuracy. Think about how massive that is for aquatic management. Instead of needing a small army to count every single fish or map out wildly complex predator-prey webs, a fisheries manager can use a simple, robust equation to manage the productive capacity of a giant body of water. It's incredibly practical.
And the magic of predictive ecology didn't stop at the shoreline. By taking that same empirical, big-picture approach, ecologists started finding unified predictive regressions, like the ones mapped out right here, that apply to forests, grasslands, and even oceans. Limnology essentially proved to the rest of the biological world that ecology doesn't just have to describe nature, it can actually predict it.
A quick comparison with oceanography is actually super interesting here. Marine biologists, out studying the vast ocean, never fell for the microcosm trap. They obviously knew the sea wasn't isolated. But ironically, because they didn't have that comforting illusion, they rarely treated their study areas as single whole systems. They got bogged down studying unique, tiny subsystems and relying on wildly complex simulation models. Because limnologists were originally tricked by the neat edges of a lake, they were forced into compiling the holistic data that ultimately handed them the keys to predictive ecology way ahead of oceanographers.
It's just an amazing journey, right? Going from a totally poetic misconception straight to hard mathematical prediction. The history of limnology really proves that sometimes looking at the world through a flawed but structured lens gives you exactly the tools you need to finally uncover the truth. So, as we wrap up our explainer today, I want to leave you with a thought to chew on. If a lake perfectly bordered by solid earth is actually fundamentally connected to the air above it and the land miles away, what other seemingly isolated systems in our lives, our societies, or our natural world are actually deeply, unavoidably connected? Definitely something to think about next time you're standing on a shoreline. Thanks so much for joining me today, and I'll catch you on the next one.